Okay. I'm supposed to give an introduction to the introduction to consciousness. Going to start out with one of my favorite painting. I have a copper drawing that my father gave me behind my desk. It's some of you may have seen it in the Vatican. It's a it represents classical Greek, Roman philosophy and mathematics. At its center is Plato and Aristotle. What are you looking for?
Just go ahead. I'll just
mess with my slides. Okay. And I brought this up because many of our ideas of consciousness can be traced back to these in Western traditions. This is always Western perspective I'm giving you here, the one I'm most familiar with, can be traced to these two men in the middle. Plato points upwards, and then Aristotle. In particular, many of you will not know one of the most sophisticated accounts of organization, including consciousness and the principle of life, was given by Aristotle. It's still around. It's now, in fact, enjoying a resurgence. The modern version is called hylomorphism, from hyloform. What he postulated is a hierarchical series of organizational forms. That's a way to think about it. That living things possess. Of course, at his time there were no significant artifacts around to worry. And so he argued in his book De Anima, which is sort of the probably oldest book, if you want to refer an old book writing on something today we'd call consciousness, would be De Anima, on souls. Psyche was the original Greek title from which we derive psychology and psychiatry. And he postulated this series of souls, which are not souls the way we might think about today in a religious sense. That's subsequently development, but really a way of organizing life. That he said, well, all living organisms, including plants and animals and humans, have what's called a nutritional soul, the life animating principle that we think we understand, which involves molecular biology and closed system thermodynamics, but which we have trouble formalizing. We don't really understand, for example, the exact border between the dead and the living, like is COVID. The virus, is that alive or dead? Then the sensitive perceptions, motions, and motivations. And this is probably the closest to what we would today recognize as consciousness. Aristotle's sensitive souls. And then only humans, particularly adults, have what we would today call rational souls, the power of thinking and intellect. And of course, that's now also shared by AI. And then it's really Plato, via the people in Roman times who took up Plato, and then particularly Thomas Aquinas here, that the notion of the soul was really taken up by Christianity and formed sort of the background, less today, but until very recently, formed the background of all people thinking, that people have souls, that these souls characterize that person, and that soul, of course, is not only immaterial, but also immortal. There's huge literature, if you read on Aristotle, and lots of disputation, but nowhere did Aristotle ever clearly articulate the notion that the soul, that his way of thinking about souls is immortal. That's really probably, at least in my reading, a post-Aristotelian notion. So it's really a supreme rational way to think about it. All right, but the modern way of thinking about the mind-body problem, so the Greeks and the Romans didn't really think about the mind-body problem in the way we would think. That really started about 500 years ago, 630, 632, 36, 42, 48. He died in 650, René Descartes. The scientist, today would call him a scientist. Of course, he was what's called a natural philosopher at the time. Also an anatomist. He did his own anatomy in his own dissection, where the most famous deduction in Western thought, first written in French, the pensée je suis cogito ergo sum, So in modern language, I'm conscious, therefore I am. He's quite explicit what he means by consciousness, including thinking, seeing, perceiving, imagining, and dreaming. And of course, he has this long, he makes both the epistemological claim as well as the ontological claim. I know that I exist because in thinking about it, even if I doubt my existence, I reaffirm it. And of course, consciousness is the only thing I have direct, unmediated access to. And so it has to be explained. And then interesting, he also was sort of the first who identified a substrate in the brain. Today would say a neural correlate in the brain, the pineal gland. And people today laugh at it, but actually it was very interesting. So the microscope was invented. In fact, he lived in Holland in exile, and it was invented 20 years earlier in another city in Leiden in the Netherlands. He didn't have access to a microscope, and when he did his dissection, when he looked at the pineal gland, he couldn't identify that there were two parts, there's a left and a right. He thought it was a unitary structure. And of course, he had this paradox that everything in the brain has two sides, the left and the right, yet there's only one conscious experience. So he made this beautiful structure function assertion and saying, well, because there's two of everything, except here in the pineal gland, there's only one consciousness, that's where the origin. And he also believed erroneously that if you lose the pineal gland, you die. That was just due to faulty anatomy. All right, so this is really ground zero for most of our thinking over the last 500 years. Now, very, very rapidly, just to give you, it's an introduction to an introduction here after all, just to give you a view. What happened in the 17th and 18th century, there was a strong and following Descartes, there was a strong and decisive turn that involved natural, what we call science, which at the time was natural philosophy, following, Newton and Huygens and Leibniz, and the enormously successful turn towards understanding the world in a rational, empirical, accessible way has really meant that what René Descartes postulated were, of course, two domains, right? Two totally separate domains of existence. One was res extant, everything that has extension, namely matter, stuff like this, including the brains of people, and then cognitive stuff, res cogitans. And that formulation allowed scientists to study just sort of to leave out the at the time still dangerous stuff, because you had to remember in 1600, Giordano de Bruno was burned at the stake. So it was somewhat dangerous to speculate about these things too much. But this division let people just focus on the res extans and do good old mechanistic investigation. That was, of course, enormously successful, so much so that most scientists or other advanced thinkers, philosophers sort of said, well, let's just forget about res cogitans totally. Let's just ultimately what truly exists in any operational accessible way is only res extans, extensive stuff, matter and energy. If we come to the last century again, almost exactly 100 years ago in Vienna, the so-called Vienna Circle of logical positivism, they extended the notion. So they were the first to talk about physicalism, to distinguish it from materialism, because they wanted to include things, matter, space, and time. Today we would also include information, and the belief that ultimately everything can be reduced to something physical, that ultimately maybe they're emergent entities, but ultimately in terms of explaining things, ultimately everything can be reduced to physical stuff and physical mechanisms. There was a very important debate at the time raging, which Vienna Circle sort of logical positivism won, between Carnap, Rudolf Carnap, who was part of the Vienna Circle, who formulated, of course, the ideas that you can eliminate the elimination of metaphysics by strictly logical analysis of language. That statements such as God exists or God doesn't exist essentially is meaningless as the babble of a baby, and you should only formulate sentences that ultimately can be operationalized and tested. And therefore, consciousness had this very dubious stature at the time and was later subsequently sort of tried to be cancelled. There's this famous debate between Qstr, who's also a member of the Vienna Circle, and Rudolf Carnap on the one hand, and Martin Heidegger in 1929 on the other, that represented Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, that represented sort of the more continental traditional approach to phenomenology. But certainly in the perception of the time, the victor of that debate was Vienna Circle. And subsequently, particularly, I think it's also interesting, this coincided with World War II and the loss, of course, of World War II, following the American involvement in the war. Sort of analytic philosophy was exported to the rest of the world, particularly to the Anglo-Saxon world, and sort of completely, utterly dominated all philosophy's departments. Such that people like Dan Dennett, could really write in their book Consciousness Explained, could really write very derisively about any other approach. Sort of dualism was sort of just beyond the pale of modern educated people. This is something that folks psychology still use, but modern educated people don't think about that at all anymore. It's like thinking about, ghosts and goblins. And so since the 1920s, in parallel, of course, there was a rise of behaviorism, Watson, that sort of didn't really rule out consciousness, but they tried to, again, eliminate it from experimental psychology, only what can be directly observed and manipulated, operant conditioning and all of that. They didn't really take any position on consciousness, positive or negative. They simply avoid using the word. Then subsequently, sort of people came up with reductive physicalism or non-reductive physicalism, the attempts to map, because people do claim and insist that they have conscious states like pain and pleasure and seeing and hearing. And so the program here was always, how can you map these cognitive states in ultimately, well, first in a reductive way onto underlying substrate, or possibly in a non-reductive way, where it would say, well, the physical substrate is still necessary to express the conscious state, but it may be in a very complex nonlinear way that right now, where they use the word emerge, that somehow consciousness, this would be non-reductive physicalism, emerges in a non-trivial way from the underlying physical substrate. There were then these, the Churchlands, Pat and Paul Churchland, and then particularly Dan Dennett, who passed away 2 years ago, who effectively try to, what I would say in modern language, cancel consciousness. That consciousness, people are simply confused about it, that consciousness doesn't really exist. What exists are behavioral, well, obviously people talk about it, that's a fact, but what truly exists, for example, when you're in pain, you have this god-awful toothache, right? You rub your jaw, you avoid eating on that side where the inflamed tooth is, you have certain behavioral dispositions, you have hormones that get released in your bloodstream. That's all. There isn't anything above and beyond. So famously, he said in the New York Times interview, qualia, bah, that's all humbug. Qualia doesn't really exist. That's just in the imaginations of people. I had many debates and had many letters with him, and I simply found it incomprehensible. In fact, at some point, I was a rock climber. I had to abort a climbing trip because I had this god-awful toothache, right? And when you have a bad pain, in fact, people kill themselves in chronic pain, right? It can be so bad. You're lying there, it's this god-awful pounding away and telling me, well, Christof, you're just confused. You're not really in pain. That's just behavioral disposition. I mean, I could never understand how people can actually believe it. But there are many, many people today who still believe it. So this is called epiphenomenalism claims that conscience exists, but has absolutely no function. But then the most radical strain that I think Dennett and certainly Patricia Churchland epitomized is this: you can just eliminate it. In 100 years from now, no one will talk about it anymore because it's obviously been replaced by neuroscience, by saying, well, my amygdala is active. I'm not in fear. I'm not scared. My amygdala is active. And that explains everything. So But what's been remarkable, so, I've been active in this field for 40 some years. And what's remarkable that over the last, certainly with the beginning of this millennium, so despite these attempts to cancel experience, to gaslight us into believing that we don't really experience, consciousness remains a singular challenge to contemporary physicalism. Because it turns out, of course, if you talk to, so I talk a lot to foundational quantum mechanics people, and it turns out, as you probably all know, that defining the physical, that used to be very easy under Cartesian res extans. In classical physics, physicalism is very easy. Things that have a position, they have a momentum, and that's all you need to describe. And if you know the position and the momentum, then everything you can determine everything. You can go all the way in the past and all the way into the future, and everything is an open book in principle. But now, of course, with quantum mechanics, roughly 100 and some years old, it became vastly more complicated, right? There's Heisenberg uncertainty, there's Schrödinger's cat experiments, superposition of state, and now we know through Bell's pair that you can have two particles, if they're entangled, they can be in opposite sides of the universe. As soon as you observe one, instantaneous, the state of the other one is also determined. That's certainly not my grandfather's materialism anymore, right? And so, I mean, this is why Einstein didn't like it and spoke about spooky action at a distance. So it turns out even physicists don't really know what physicalism exactly is anymore. And then there are now movements within physics itself. This has nothing to do with us consciousness researcher. There are movements in physics itself to, for example, do we need to get rid of the absolute matter of fact? In other words, is it true that there are no matter of facts unless they become observed? So you cannot say that there's a particle that has a specific mass or spin until it interacts with something or until it's observed. That's really a radical turn from classical physics. And the other thing that's sort of been pleasantly surprising to me, we've become much more diverse in our intellectual outlook, and there's this revival of older ideas that's been around for thousands of years. In particular, idealism. How many of you are familiar with Bernardo Kastrup? Okay, so so essentially he channels Arthur Schopenhauer, essentially a modern form of idealism. And then, of course, their panpsychism has sort of surprisingly, again, this is always in Western philosophy. Of course, it's been around in other people's thinking for millennia, but this is within Western tradition. Now, of course, there have always been, as I said, Buddhism, the Japanese philosophers, the French and German philosophers, who have had ideas about, continue to develop ideas about phenomenology and about consciousness, but they haven't really been mainstream, at least mainstream in our tradition. Sort of that's been until recently dominated by Anglo-American philosophers. All right, so what's interesting, so at least we can all agree we've decisively shifted away from cardiac-based thinking. Because if you read, for example, about the Egyptian mummies, they threw the brain away. They thought it was totally irrelevant. The liver was important. The heart was important. Aristotle, who knew so much, this is what Aristotle, so the Greeks thought, not all, but the Greeks thought, Aristotle articulated the view that the brain is primarily there for cooling the hot blood. It's interesting, those of us who grew up, within Christian tradition, Old and New Testament, there's not a single mention of the brain. Lots of it, there's as you all know, I mean, there's Sacred Heart academies, there's Sacred Heart churches. There's no Sacred Brain Academy or Sacred Brain Church. And even today, you love your sweetheart with all your heart. You wear your heart on your sleeve. People are heartless. So it's interesting. Even today, our language is pervaded by cardiac based thinking. And it's really, again, only during the Enlightenment, Harvey, early 17th century, that people begin to realize that the brain is more than just a sort of a part of the air conditioning of the body. Now, of course, there were always exceptions. You can always go back and find some thinker who was right on the money. Of course, this is from a dialogue attributed to Hippocrates. There are also Galen or other surgeons or doctors, we would today call doctors, associated with the gladiator school, that realized that the brain is really critical for the motor control. But again, it's sort of that's mainstream. People look at the brain and manipulate the brain. That's really only over the last 400 years. Particularly over the last 150 years, those are two very famous brains. They were recently reconstructed and people did MRI scans on them. Those are the original two brains that Broca, the French neurologist Broca, identified in 1861 or so, where he said there are these lesions, a superficial lesion in the left inferior frontal gyrus in two different brains here. And both had expressive aphasia. They were unable to speak. They could understand speech, but they were unable to express it. And that was really the opening shot that's really very important for us historically, because that really put localist thinking mainstream, right? That they are specific, that the brain just isn't sort of this amorphous organ, maybe like the liver or like the kidney is, but specific part of the brain subserves specific function. And that really started 150 years ago in functional neurology with Broca. That's really important. Then over the next 50 years, well, and ever since then, the ever more precise realization that not only, so this is the early 19th century, that people realize that all organisms are made out of one or more cells, right? That's the cell doctrine, roughly 200 years old. But then specifically the brain, that there are different, that the brain is made out, it's not just this continuous synthesia, as people had argued, but actually consists of discrete units, these neurons. Golgi and Cajal got just to put a date on, this is when they got the Nobel Prize in 1906. Golgi and Raymond y Cajal, the realization that different types of neurons, are Purkinje cells and amacrine cells, pyramidal cells. Now our latest Nature paper in the Atlas, the Allen Brain Institute Atlas, says there are roughly 5,000 types of cells. Different types of cells in the brain, whether the mammalian brain, doesn't matter whether it's a human, a mouse, or a non-human primate, a monkey brain, there are roughly 5,000 different types of cells. Each one has a distinct molecular constitution, has distinct morphology, has distinct synaptic input, output, and particularly there are specific genes that are expressed in these 5,000 different cells, which gives us technological access using optogenetics and other tools to manipulate them. Furthermore, there's a belief that many neurological diseases like ALS or Alzheimer have an origin in specific types of cells. So that's really very important. Started roughly 120 years ago. What's also important for us that study the consciousness is the realization of the unconscious. But again, that's relatively recent. First articulated in the philosophical domain by Friedrich Nietzsche, but then really by Freud and Jean Genet in Paris. I just put there an arbitrary date, 1900. That's a publication of Freud's The Interpretation of Dream. The realization that much of our life, in particular our motivations, is governed by unconscious desires, fears, etc., that we don't have access to at all. They're either deeply buried in the unconscious, or you can make them accessible by, therapy. You can access them through dreams, etc., etc. Well, the specific notions of Freud, we don't believe in that anymore. But I think what's singular for him, we got to remember, he actually was a neuroanatomist first. That's where he got his PhD, his doctorate in. Is this realization that so much of our, the iceberg model, that so much of what we do and how we act and who we love and who we hate, we don't have conscious access to. Evolution has not given access to in terms of consciousness. Gestalt psychology was important, particularly for perceptual consciousness. And that, by the way, led to an outpouring of writing about consciousness, however, that then ended with the rise of behaviorism that was contemporarily or maybe 10 years later. And then all writing on consciousness effectively ceased till the 60s or so. Other important things, discovery of the reticular activating system, that the set of nuclei in the brainstem is really essential to control wakefulness and sleep, that they're discrete nuclei for all of this, that sleep is a highly controlled, because again, this was all very controversial, that sleep is a very finely controlled state, and of course, later on, the discovery of REM sleep. And then that sort of little emphasized today, there was this period of great fecundity in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There were 3 sets of patients that were studied with respect to consciousness also. People like HM, right, the realization that different forms of memory, some are conscious, some are not conscious. Blindsight used to be very controversial, is now accepted. In fact, it's rarely spoken about today anymore. The fact that patients with rare lesions to the occipital lobe can respond, so they can have visual behaviors in the absence of having experiences, visual experiences. And then, of course, split brain patients of Roger Sperry, for which he would also get the Nobel Prize. The realization that if you cut the brain totally across the commissure, including the posterior and the anterior commissure, the evidence at the time suggested that you can get not only the specialization, the language dominates on the left, but also, as far as, and Sperry certainly articulated this point of view, there are 2 conscious entities in one brain, one in the left and one in the right. And then I think what made a big difference to the rise in the 80s and early 90s, including the work that I did, was brain imaging. Just as always, progress in science is very heavily driven by experimental methods and tools and techniques. I think people like to emphasize, well, it's ideas, but I think the ideas float around for many years, maybe even decades or centuries, but then suddenly there's a right technique that allows you to measure something or manipulate something. And that was first PET, and then, of course, fMRI. Then proximally, what triggered certainly this, all the writing I did with Francis Crick, but also Jerry Edelman and many others, was the rediscovery, I should say, because it was first characterized early on by Lord Adrian, of the 40 Hz neuronal oscillations in anesthetized cat and then awake kittens. And it was thought to be a cool discovery that revealed how binding could go on using 40 Hz oscillation. And then I think what was also very important for this, the first rise of modern theories, was Francis Crick and Jerry Edelman, both Nobel laureates, who published widely on consciousness. Francis Crick, his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, and Jerry Edelman, his 1990 book, The Remembered Present. Of course, Giulio at the time was a postdoc with Jerry Edelman and at the Rockefeller before Jerry Edelman moved to the Salk Institute, to the Scripps Institute, just north of the Salk Institute, where Francis Crick had moved to. So these are some of the historical events that brought us today. Today, it's all about the brain. Note that the mouse brain is almost exactly 1,000 times smaller, 17 million neurons, roughly 16 billion cortical neurons, 86 billion neurons overall. Yeah, then you're all familiar with sort of a more modern formulation of consciousness by Thomas Nagel, something that it is like for the organism. Notice there's no behavior here in this definition at all. It's just about what does it feel. And so we could, at least here, not everywhere among students of consciousness, but certainly in my writing, I always stress that consciousness, and there are different words. Some people use awareness, other people use consciousness. It's interesting. You can study the sociology who uses what word, but they're essentially equivalent. There's no operational way to distinguish between awareness and consciousness. Is identical to having, again, these are different words, subjective, phenomenal, mental experiences. Whole gamut. Being in love, in pain, bored, dreading, everything that makes life living is consciousness. Now, as you all know, or most of you know, many people who study consciousness say they write consciousness, put consciousness in the title of their book or their paper, but then actually do this sleight of hand that first Dan Dennett, among others, did in his book explaining consciousness, where as far as I'm concerned, he didn't explain anything about consciousness. He explained it away. In fact, that's what he did. They substitute this very subtle move. They substitute phenomenology because either that doesn't exist, or we don't know whether it exists, or it can't be studied because we cannot directly access other people's phenomenology. So let's do something easier, namely study function, but then forget that we did this sleight of hand and claim, oh, we are studying consciousness. Right, this is widespread. Many people do it, particularly today in AI, when the discussion. So, as you all know, there are now this discussion about conscious sentient AI everywhere, and almost always they sort of align. They put this equivalence relation between intelligence and consciousness. Intelligence, of course, is all about doing; it's not about being. And then they say, well, because they study consciousness, but just talk about functions like intelligence. But we all know, I mean, I certainly argue, Giulio does, IIT does, that conscious can be dissociated from all these things like computation, behavior, intelligence, planning, reasoning, social cognition, top-down attention, working memory. What do I mean by that? Clearly, all these things exist in us, and they can be commingled, like when I pay attention to this pen, and I become conscious of it, right? And I can put it in my memory. I can remember yesterday this pink. I can remember tomorrow that I picked up this pen. We have to be experimentally. The entire art consists in trying to separate that. So there are several ways you can study it. It's very difficult to study this in animals. It can be done, but it's much more difficult to study cases where consciousness dissociated from behavior. So, of course, we do this every night, dreaming. You can study it in animals, has been done. Meditating, I don't know any study of meditation in animals, but in principle, it might be done. And tripping. Of course, there's a huge industry that does tripping in rats and mice using the so-called, what's the behavioral readouts, the so-called HDR head twitch response that rodents display when you give them psilocybin or LSD or DMT or other psychedelic substances. But of course, we don't know what their experience is. And having worked with psychedelic animals for the last 5 years, I'm extremely skeptical that they have anything close to our type of experiences that we have under, for example, magic mushroom. Much more interesting is to study monkeys. There is one lab, Doris Sau lab, that studies mushrooms in monkeys. It's interesting. They sit in the complete dark, and then they do like this imaginary fly catching. So that's much closer to I think what human experience, and certainly much closer than a mouse twitching its head. And we got to remember that when we determine consciousness in others experimentally, or we inferred, it's always an inference, a probabilistic inference to the best explanation. Right, so I don't know that you're conscious. I assume you're all conscious because you're so similar to me. Your brain is so similar to me. Your behavior, we are all genetically closely related. But the farther we move away from Homo sapiens, from normally developed Homo sapiens, the more difficult it gets. So, for example, in babies, very young newborn, it's more difficult. In anencephalic infants that don't even have a well-developed forebrain, it becomes very difficult. In behavioral unresponsive patients in the ICU, it becomes difficult. In non-human animals, it's difficult. And of course, in aliens, which we haven't encountered yet, and of course, in computers, it becomes very, very difficult. And I don't think it can really be done unless we have a theory of consciousness that's been validated in us. Because we are the only creatures, in the limits only me, but by inference, Homo sapiens that is conscious for sure. And so we always need to test the theories in us first. All right, so today I mean, today, you know, in this year and over the last years, we've focused a lot on NCC, and they're getting ever more refined. So, you know, early on with Francis Crick, this was like, I don't know, back in a long time ago when I still not attained the holy state of tenure with Francis Crick, thinking about, you know, a pragmatic program. It was, we designed it on purpose to be agnostic, you know, independent of whether it's materialist or physicalist or dualist. You know, there are going to be these substrate in the brain, and let's go look for them. It should be the ones that are jointly sufficient, and it's causal. So if you induce the NCC using, you know, a BCI or optogenetics, whatever, you induce a percept. If you inactivate the NCC, you'll eliminate the experience. A purely formulated empirical program. Now, today, 30 years later, we have these I'm not going to talk about it in detail. We have these very large-scale collaborations. So that's what happened over the last 30 years, where it changed from doing something that you do either if you're a young scientist, you either do it under the protection of a very senior scientist, or you have to do it in the underground. You can't really publish about it, to something that, you know, involves now, in this case, you know, 30 or 40 people. And this is the first experiment of 2 experiments, and there are 4 other of these adversarial collaborations. So it's gotten certainly much more popular. Just wanted to remind you, showing this cute illusion, that the relationship is just one illusion, that the relationship between consciousness and the external world can be very, very complex, nonlinear and non-stationary, as here. So if you fixate at the cause, what do you see? Yeah, which is really remarkable, right? You should see a green disk moving, but in fact, what's there, you don't. What is actually there, you don't see, and what you see is not there, right? There's no single green disk. Instead, there are these 11 pink disks. But due to 3 different, it's just a really beautiful illusion, which combines Troxler fading and color adaptation, really to make this point very clearly that, you know, against realism, we all think, you know, the world is out there, but in this case, of course, the world is very, very complex. The perceived world is very complex, maybe quite different from what's actually out there. And the other thing we got to remind ourselves, how many see this as blue and black? Wow, the majority. And how many see it as it really is? It's so striking. I love this illusion because it shows, you know, and then people ask routinely when I give public talks, they ask me, well, professor, but what's the real color? Well, there is no real color, right? There are photons of a particular wavelength that strike the dress, that are reflected into our eyes and then get processed. But you can make the point here, what's true for color is true for everything else, including space and time, right? Because there can be occasions when space utterly disappears, perceived space, or when you are a moment of timelessness that can be neither too long nor too short. It simply is when all of that disappears, right? And all of it is a construct made by our brains. All right. Okay, so what's been happening over the last 35 years since most of you were born? Well, so you know, there are ever more precise experiments, that several coming out now the next couple of weeks, doing auditory and somatosensory, trying to isolate the NCC from, you know, things like selective attention, or from memory, or from response using, you know, the no response paradigm. The people are really trying to diversify. There's more diversification. Early on, 99% was all in vision. either in human or in monkeys and then in mice. So now people study many other domains: audition, touch, interoception. Recently was this cool paper. Did you know if you really know your body, you can listen to your heartbeat? But I just discovered this recently. It's pretty cool. You can lie in bed once you do, Vipassana or some other technique and actually listen to your heartbeat. It's very relaxing. It's interesting. And there's going to be a neural correlate of that, probably in the insula, right? So it's gotten much more diverse, much more interesting, because there are all these different modalities. Biomarkers for consciousness, I'll briefly mention: altered state of consciousness, theories of consciousness, and of course AI. So let me just, disorders of consciousness and biomarkers. Why is this of interest? Well, so when you study consciousness, when you talk to the general public or to your mom trying to explain what you do, very often comes across as being very airy-fairy and abstract, mind-body problem. How does this pertain to me? But then when you come into the clinic, when one of you has a heart attack or cardiac or hemorrhage or a TBI, you get into the clinic and you're there now in the clinic, behavioral unresponsive, like this. Within 3 to 5 days, both in Europe as well as in the US, your doctor, the neurointensivist, will initiate discussion with your family. Is this what she or he would have wanted? And in 70 to 90% of the time, the decision is no, and they pull the ventilator support, right? So these are people, this used to be known as vegetative state. They're now known as unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. It's really the same, where patients don't respond. So you shine a light, they don't move their eyes. You ask them to move their eyes or fingers, they don't. You pull or you pinch very hard the fingernail to evoke a pain response, they don't withdraw. So behaviorally, they're unresponsive. And today in the clinic, in clinical practice, unresponsive means unconscious. And then you initiate these discussions, and most of these people die. 5 minutes, yeah. But we now know there's this entire new phenomenon now known as covert consciousness, that you can be unresponsive but still be conscious. Roughly 25%, 1 out of 4 of these patients is covertly conscious. So what we really need, and of course, perturbational complexity index is doing this, we need very specific and sensitive biomarkers. Terry Shiver in the US, you may know. Here in Europe, you may know this guy who was in a bicycle accident, to help identify these patients. So this is a practical payoff of the science of consciousness, biomarkers, specific and sensitive biomarkers that you can use in the clinic. People are now much more willing to talk about the wide diversity. This just came out. There was a consensus article with a bunch of scientists studying, psychologists mainly, studying other forms of consciousness in psychiatric condition or in neurological condition. Particularly, of course, let's skip this, psychedelic-induced experiences or mystical experiences that you can get during meditation or other forms of like dark retreat I mentioned yesterday, or during psychedelics. So that's it. So I think the future is my second last slide. The future of consciousness study is really ever more refined experiments involving, ultimately what we need is causal manipulation. Doing fMRI or EEG or electrodes, that's all fine, but ultimately we need to move from correlation to causation. That has to require causal manipulations in animals, of course, but also in people. And we want to drive, the MCC down to the circuit, like the layer 5 backpropagating action potential hypothesis or other things to the circuit and the cellular level. Quantum mechanics. So there's a huge amount of speculation about the involvement of quantum mechanics in consciousness. Right now, there's no strong, compelling evidence for that non-trivial. Of course, quantum mechanics describes everything in the universe, every piece of furniture, including this particular one. But people are interested in non-trivial, i.e. superposition and entanglement. If people can discover such facts, and in a reproducible way, I think that would be a huge deal, but that hasn't happened yet. We want specific and sensitive practical measures. We need something, just like an ultrasound that you can, because there are tens of thousands of these patients in ICUs and elsewhere, emergency rooms throughout the world. So we need reliable, specific, and practical biomarkers. Psychedelics, so it's likely that in the next year or two, maybe, the FDA will certainly approve and may possibly deschedules various psychedelics, both here in Europe as well as in the US. And so that gives rise to lots and lots of really cool experiments that manipulate conscious experience without manipulating behavior too much. My worry is, in the absence, so there's an explosion of theory. Almost every single day I get manuscripts saying, oh, I have a new theory of consciousness. And I think there's a danger there. There's all these theories, and making theories ever more elaborate. What's really important for this, and if you look at the history of physics, for example, quantum mechanics, special and general relativity, they were accepted relatively quickly by the scientific community because there was simple but decisive evidence in favor of them. So it's really important when we think about IIT that it's really a sort of relatively urgent matter over the next several years to make predictions that we can experimentally verify today, or let's say in the next 5 years from now, using existing technology. Otherwise, I fear there's going to be a backlash against all theories of consciousness of the sort we've seen already, last year with that letter. And of course, the other fact that we just have to accept, there is now a widespread belief already in the community. If you just talk to regular people, if you talk to therapists who now have to deal with their patients going to chatbots, ChatGPT or other chatbots, and doing psychoanalysis with them, to people falling in love with their AI, it is a fact that many people accept that today already AI is conscious, whether or not that's justified. So how do we deal with that, and with all the implications of that for studying consciousness? Whether it's true, I mean, there's one question: is it true or not, based on IIT or other theories? But B, the public is going to run ahead of it. They're not going to wait for us scientists to agree which theory of consciousness is the right one. Right? They're going to believe it because, of course, they're so convincing. And so how do we deal with that? That's a big challenge for the year ahead. And with that, I thank you.